Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and it really is afternoon. And welcome to this very first in our Wednesday webinar series hosted by CHSE. We're going to, in the following weeks, unpack a whole lot of thinking and ideas relating to the concept of literacies. And what we wanted to do was use this as I'm going to just show you that I'm a real person before we carry on, with a sore neck. So what we were going to do was use this as a vehicle for prompting people to have conversations about their teaching and about students' learning and about what it is we can do to improve those things through the lens of specific types of literacy. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you in the chat to drop in a word. When I say to you, what is literacy? What is the first thing that comes to your mind? And it can just be the very first thing. Just type it in the chat for me now. Bearing in mind, there's no right or wrong answer, right? Yes, Purnima. Reading and writing. Information search, yeah. Zell, ability, yes, it helps us. Yeah, so look, that's important. Comprehension and steward knowledge and experience. So we're talking about being completely literate. And knowledge of the subject. Okay, that's just about everyone. So that's really something I think that we need to unpack, in that the very first thing that most people think about when they say what is literacy is to go straight to what is knowing. And there is, I think, some very, very distinctive differences between knowing something and being literate in, for example, a practice. So in the next few slides, what I want to do is have a look at why it is we want to do this series particularly, and what it is we think we're going to get to. I also do want you to interrupt anytime you want to. So I'm going to try and be fairly interactive and ask you lots of questions, but I also do want you to just jump in if there's something that you want to contribute and share. Christine, I just want you to tell me if my slides are changing on the screen.
They are?
Yay. All right, so we briefly organized a series involving several of the literacies that are out there, and these, of course, are not all of them. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking about an introduction to talking about literacy, and I think it's quite important to unpack why it is we wanted at least three weeks to talk about it. The first one is just basically definitions and getting us oriented. In next week's session, we're going to talk about feedback literacy from the point of view of lecturers. So how it is that you can get feedback on what you're doing and what you're supposed to do with that feedback when you have it. So in an evaluatory sense, as a lecturer, how do you know what you're doing? And why it's important to do that right at the front of the series is so that you can use those tools as you go through to look at the kinds of literacies you want to teach and to think about how it is that your class could learn those. So next week is about evaluation of your practice. And then the week after that, we'll be debunking myths about blended learning. Thanks, Lizelle. We're all looking forward to that. So that would be the April sessions. And when we head into May, I think the concept of evaluative judgment in assessment is an important one, because the whole idea behind literacy is it's more than just knowing. So how are you going to know if your students or if your classes are understanding holistically what the concept is that you're trying to get at, rather than just being able to memorize facts and give them back to you in an exam? And therefore, the concept of how students get feedback and what they actually get from that feedback and how it is that we could do it so that they understand better, for example, maybe in a dialogic sense, how their learning can progress. is a series that is all of its own. We could have done in over a year, I think, as with all of these. Then in June, we'll deal with digital literacy, and we had to put in brackets, including AI literacy, because I think a lot of people see the like the letters AI, and that gives a message all of its own. So AI literacy will be included. And Myrtle made a very good point to me last night. She was saying when people think that they can use technology, they think that they have technological literacy, digital literacy. But literacy is a lot more than just being able to use the technology. It's about choosing what technology is appropriate. And it's also about understanding how that technology is facilitating what it is that you want the students to be able to do and what the students choose to do with it. So a lot more than just the knowing apps and knowing buttons and where to turn it on. And it will devolve, I think, into the idea that there are places where we can really embed technology in the education that we give without disrupting the kind of teaching that we're wanting to do. July has the most number of Wednesdays. And so we had to use July for the concept of academic literacy. And that's really much more than the idea of being able to read and write. Although reading and writing is a good start. And all of you will be aware that South Africa has some of the lowest literacy rates in the world. They do that, grade 4 test every year. And our grade 4s do not shine well in relation to the world in terms of reading for meaning. So although they can probably string the sounds together, they don't really know what they mean. And sometimes also in terms of numeracy. So academic literacy is something that from scratch we need to build on. And it's, in a sense, much deeper than the reading and writing skills that we want, particularly when it gets to higher education. And it's closely linked to the idea of information literacy. So how do you know where to find your information, and how do you know your information is credible? In this day and age, we're living, they tell me, in a post-truth world where fake news is all around us, and also where ChatGPT tells you rubbish when you ask it questions that it doesn't know the answer to. So the concept of information literacy is one that I think we have to underpin throughout the range of our teaching, not just for first years to understand and know where to get things, but all the way through with regard to the integrity of what it is that we want our students to produce for us. Then in the health sciences particularly, communication literacy is an issue. We want people to be able to communicate, and that is through the hierarchical structures in hospitals, for example, or across the barrage of a team, and we say in service to good patient care, but also in service to the health of the nation, in understanding what are the important priorities in healthcare and in the social determinants of health. So understanding that communication is not just having a chat with the person next door to you, but that the implications of being communication literate are much more far-reaching than just having those, role-playing events with your class and saying, tick, we did communication. It also speaks to the whole concept of cultural competence. So cultural competence is different, really, slightly from cultural literacy, because literacy would imply that you are aware enough to be able to ascertain the different cultures and the different ways in which those cultures operate, as opposed to just being able to say, oh, I see a difference and I'll have to deal with the difference as it comes. So we've brought those ideas into the series on communication literacy, and hopefully we'll land up with giving you that whole list of how do you deal with diversity in your classroom, How do you deal with difficult questions in your classroom without shirking your responsibility of helping people to be better human beings when they get out there? So no knee-jerk reactions. And then the last month of the series will be in October. I wanted to call it rules literacy. And my team wouldn't let me. So we thought exploring university policies and frameworks is also a kind of literacy. You need to know what's mandated by the university and possibly why, but also where to find these things and what they mean once you've found them, because some of the standing orders are really difficult to interpret. So if you have any special requests for what you think could go on there, I'd be very, very happy to plan in advance for the kinds of questions you will ask. So obviously, our team will be involved in a lot of these discussions and in a lot of the work going forward. But we've also asked people who are experts in their field to come in and give us their expertise with regard to the specific kinds of literacies that we're going to talk about in each week of the months that are up there. So I want to pause at this stage and ask if anybody wants to ask a question or make a suggestion for how we move forward with this whole series and what it is we were wanting to do with it. Okay, no hands up. Everyone's happy to hear my growling voice. It's fine. Obviously, this is an open conversation and it's going to be a continuous conversation. So I'm hoping it's a place where people can start to have aha moments and think about things, and you have as much interplay in directing where we land up with this as all the rest of us. So I do want it to be that kind of an open forum. So if I had to ask you, what is the most famous literary quote about literacy that you know, what would you say? And you can drop that in the chat for me. What is the most famous literacy quote that you know? Sorry, I'm just going to see if I can get the chat on another device. Yes, I like that. Pen is mightier than the sword. Yeah, Christine, the hard part isn't about finding information, but knowing when not to use it. No great inspiration. Nothing comes to mind when I say, what's your favorite literacy quote? I'm not seeing people typing hectically.
It's hard to find the urge to quickly Google literacy quotes.
No, you mustn't, Stuart. No Googling. It's what's in your head. I want to know if there's anybody who hasn't heard this one. Okay. Education is the most powerful weapon with which you can change the world. And why do I call this a literacy quote? Because he meant so much more out of the word education. What he was saying was we need to move people from abject poverty to flourishing economic growth. We need to move people from living in their silos of diversity to this rainbow nation that we were going to develop as a mélange. Kennedy, if you want to hide something, put it in a book. Yes, I think you probably could have a point there. I like that. But I think that people quote him out of context is what I was trying to say. He spoke about it in a positive sense, as education is the thing that with which we're going to change the world. And that was just pre-1994, thereabouts. And then look what happened to the South African healthcare system over the next 30 years. So people went around and looked at the best education system and I'm not correlating that with the healthcare system, but education system in all the countries, and decided to bring the best of everything to South Africa, and it didn't really work. So there's now a lot of post all of the change white papers and green papers work about what did work and what didn't work, and a lot of it didn't work. And I think that the idea was that we would upskill everybody in a sort of block. And what really happened was that people didn't understand the systems that were brought in, and the upskilling didn't happen. And so people began to feel that they needed to achieve their targets and their tick boxes by showing what it was that they'd done. And now this doesn't imply at all that people didn't put their hearts and soul into the work. But what it does imply is that we did not develop a literate nation. And maybe that's where he was going with this. I'll give you another one. Aristotle being the oldest of all of these, of course. Purnima, I like yours. The more we read, the more we know and learn. So who gets your vote out of this one? What do you think Gandhi meant by that? Somebody willing to tell me? Live as if you were to die tomorrow. Okay, so that means give it a full go every day. And learn as if you were to live forever. So that means put your maximal efforts into learning as much as you can how you learn it.
Hi, Shirra.
I like the next one. Yeah, I'm not hearing you. Can you maybe get to a microphone? Very faint, yes. Share with us.
So what I got from that, learn as if you were to live forever, it also encompasses change. Of course, if you were to live forever, you would go through a whole series of evolving and change. And with change, you'd need to be learning new things. So you'd be learning forever.
Yeah, I really like that. Because one of the things we say as part of the, I was going to say the output of the faculty, but the famous Wits graduate, we say we're producing lifelong learners. And I want to know where we do that. Where do we teach our learners that they have to keep up with things and understand the systems and structures so that they can further their knowledge as the longer they're in their profession? So that's very much what I think Gandhi was getting. Purnima, you're right, that the knowledge base is not static. And because it's not, you have to keep up. You have to keep learning. And Yeats, underneath that, education is not the filling of a pail, that's, the whole banking philosophy, but lighting of a fire. So I like the metaphor very much that if I have a candle and I light another candle, I lose no light from my candle, but now we have two candles. And when you see that going, around a group where everybody's lighting candles from everybody else, and the light just gets more and more. So maybe that's what Nelson Mandela wanted for us. Lighting the candles. Yes, no, maybe. All right, another very famous concept of literacy was put forward by Kofi Annan, who was the previous General Secretary of the UN. You'll see most people quoting him as literacy is a bridge from misery to hope. That's his famous quote, but he carries on. He takes it further. It's a platform for democratization and a vehicle for the promotion of cultural and national identity. So that's what I was getting at earlier on. When literacy speaks to understanding other people's practice, that doesn't mean to say that you have to follow their practice, but giving space and understanding it is an important part of the idea that there is space in the world for everybody. And then he goes further to say, literacy is, along with education, a basic human right. And so he's making the strong separation here between literacy as a social practice and education as knowing facts, as being exposed to different professional knowledges and what you do with them. So when people tell you, Kofi Annan said literacy is a bridge from misery to hope, you can then tell them, and he said a whole lot more about that too. And Stuart, yeah, keep your hat on. I couldn't speak about literacy without speaking about two more specific people. The first very famous one, because he is a theorist of the South, and don't we love those? So we're not following the hegemonic structure of the North, but we're following the South. So Paulo Freire wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, very famous book, where he speaks about that banking model of education where students are fed facts literally by a knowledgeable teacher standing in the front, kind of, and then those facts are checked and therefore the student is said to be educated. And he said you can raise a whole nation out of poverty, just like our previous two quotes said, by helping them develop literacy. So he called it liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not in transferals of information. And you should read the whole book for many of his other central tenets. But he brought much of South America out of the doldrums and into a stage where people were contributing individuals by working on the concept of literacy rather than just factual knowledge. Has anybody read it? Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's for a rainy Sunday afternoon. An interesting book. So from Paulo Freire, I'll switch back to the North and speak about a sociologist of education who was called Basil Bernstein. And why I want to talk about how people thought about literacy versus education, he put it very easily for us to look at, to take forward in our own practice. He said, the pedagogic device, what happens when you're teaching people, is that there is an instructional discourse, and that is the content information of the particular discourse you're speaking about. So if it's about learning cardiology, or if it's about learning accounting, or whatever your instructional discourse is. And then, along with every instructional discourse, there's a regulative discourse. And the regulative discourse within the classroom or within the lecture theatre or even on the online space is the rules of the game. Sorry, offline for a cough. So I'm going to ask you what the rules of the game are in your circumstance. So what I mean rules of the game, what is it important for students to know in the way that you teach so that they can get the best out of it? Into the chat. So did you get my question? What are your rules of the game for your particular subject? What do students have to know in order to be successful in your subject? I'm not seeing anyone take the bait. You don't have to type it in the chat. You can just say it if you like.
So Shirra, if I can maybe jump in here.
Yes, go ahead, Stuart.
So I obviously a big fan of Bernstein, but what I'm always trying to get across to the students is what's going to make them successful when they get to the clinical setting is much more about who they are than what they know. Because in an environment where their role changes the whole time and where knowledge is changing the whole time, if they've learned how to adapt and how to learn in new situations, that's going to be what makes them the most successful. And I teach a lot of motor skills, and it's amazing how, first of all, you need to teach people how to learn motor skills before you can start teaching the motor skills. So that sort of learning how to learn becomes maybe the most important thing. And even the last few years, it's amazing how much things change with the skills that you need. So that being able to gain new skills is probably the most useful thing.
So that's really useful, Stuart. Thanks. And that's exactly what he meant, I think, by the regulative discourse, is that there are rules around the knowledge that you're gaining in this particular subject, whatever you're learning. So with Kennedy, you're saying understanding the principles. Lizzo, I like that. Be willing to challenge themselves. So that's a good rule of the game. Because some people come in and don't want to be challenged at all. They just want to get it right. Being able to read for meaning and engage critical thinking. So that's very much what Paulo Freire wanted. He didn't want people to just be able to read. He wanted them to read for meaning. And in the regulative discourse of Bernstein, what he's trying to say is that you need to understand what that for meaning means. In other words, what is it that you have to do in order to be successful in this particular subject? So what helps you think about they might be tacit rules. They also might be unsaid rules. But like Stuart's example said, he has to teach people how to learn motor skills before he teaches the motor skill. So compartmentalize, but don't isolate. And is that the way? What specifically is your field? What are you teaching your students?
So, hello, I'm in anatomy, so histology. You have to learn the histology with your physiology and your other disciplines. So while you know, okay, this is the histology, but you have to be able to learn it in conjunction to the other disciplines as well. And this goes beyond the class as well, that you need to see the relations between the different disciplines, or even later in life, you have to be able to see the connections between the things that you learn, and not just learn one thing and then just focus on that, but create these connections. So I think that's what I was going for with that statement.
Okay, that really does make it a little bit clearer. Thanks. And that's exactly the point. The point is the knowledge that you're learning, what's of value in the literacy practice of histology is not being able to recognize the cell, right? It's being able to know where that knowledge would be useful in practice, and where it has implications for other knowledges and other ways of being. Yeah, yes. So we're getting a little bit deep here. But a key point to stop and think about over here is, what sort of objectives do we set our students? A lot of the time, the objectives that we see written for courses are content related. So things the students should cover, things the students should know about, the list of topics that will be important for them to be able to write exams on, etc. We don't often look at the students' literacy in our particular discourse. So how are they able to make connections between this and other things? And how are they able to understand the underlying rules of the game, Bernstein called it, in the practices that they're engaging in? So a classic example is that of the community of practice. You know, that's a phrase we throw around easily these days. But the terminology of that community of practice is important, because people are legitimate participants, whether they're peripheral participants or more further in. So experiencing that discourse, the subject that you're learning, or the environment that you're learning it in, and your learning is then emphasized towards mastery of the entire community of practice, not just the certain knowledges that you need to know. So when you have, Stuart, for example, students going into the hospital having learned clinical skills beforehand, you want them to understand where those clinical skills can be used, but also in that hospital environment, they need to know when they can approach a patient, how they should approach a patient, when their consultant tells them to do something, who they can ask if they're not quite sure what the instruction was. So all of those localizing things about being in an environment contributes to literacy over and above the knowledge that it is that the student has. And that also speaks to background and culture, because if people come from a culture where it's fine to ask anybody, including the head of the unit, something that you wanted to know, as opposed to a culture where people would never dream of asking a senior and they have to find somebody comparable to be able to ask a question to. That allows access to enculturation into that community of practice differently for different students. And then that gives rise to all the literature that we speak about with regard to things like epistemic justice on the one hand, or I saw a paper the other day talking about epistemic violence. So what is it in our learning environment can cause harm to students or doesn't allow them to progress like other students do because of us not seeing what's holding them back. Okay, I'm going to stop there and ask how people feel now about that straightforward concept of literacy. You said right at the beginning, reading and writing or having knowledge. And now we've delved right into the personalities and the people who really try to unpack literacy and say, in all those spheres, as in all those months we're going to go through, how it is that people understand the regulative discourse, because that's what makes you literate. So in the really old days, like 200 years ago, literate people knew which knives and forks to use in a banquet. Okay, that marked you as, unfortunately to say, a gentleman, and a gentleman of education and knowledge of the world. And those things were considered great literacies. Luckily for us, the world has moved on. And those things are not really, I think, considered high in terms of literacy practices. But it definitely does open our eyes to the idea that it's not the instructional discourse that makes you somebody literate. It is the regulative discourse. Okay, so now let's get to the core and the key. As we said right in the beginning, it's not just about reading and writing. We have to speak about all those things, and that's why we've broken it down into the different literacies: navigating technology, communicating ideas in different forms, and then enculturation into diverse practices. And that word is intentional, because enculturation means, and we'll ask the ethnographer amongst us, but it really does mean putting yourself within the environment as one of the environment. So not just standing outside and watching it, but living it inside. Enculturation, nice word. And then I really liked, this was from a paper of a literacy expert, and she was saying, at its simplest, consider literacy as the way that we interact with the world around us, how we shape it and are shaped by it. So that even speaks to things like social literacy. If you're in a group, do you know who you can talk to and who you shouldn't? Or if you're at an event, do you know whether you have to pay for drinks or whether the drinks are free? All of those kind of social cues that we pick up from being in the environment and from knowing how things work, I think are important to our overall concept of what literacy actually is. And the truth is, so it's humbling to say, that none of us are completely literate. I mean, in whatever practices we choose to be in. and that literacy is a dynamic thing and that we need to work on it continuously. It's not that you understand a body of knowledge and that makes you literate in that field. It doesn't. It gives you the tools to be literate, perhaps. And let's talk about tools to be literate. So who can tell me what that says? You can tell me what it is. Let's start with that. I'm sensing an awful silence. Yes, Purnima, Chinese characters. Okay,
I'm not literate. I'm not literate to interpret this.
Yes, Lizelle. Good point there. So it's a street sign. Okay, it's telling you what street you're on.
I'm the X in the box.
Yeah. None of us are able to interpret it because we don't have pan-language literacy. And you might have Google Translate. So you could, I don't know if somebody took a picture of that and put it through their phone. And all these fancy AIs now that will give you translations as you go. But actually, if you were stuck in China and you'd gotten off the train and you knew you had 2 more trains to catch, how would you know where to go and what to do? Bearing in mind that a lot of people would not be speaking your language and wouldn't know what your language was. And I chose China because it's far away. Yes, thanks, Jean-Luc. Ways of improving our literacy using technology. But what I meant was, so English is not important in large swathes of China. You wouldn't find somebody who could speak English or French or German or Italian or any other thing that you wanted to talk about. But this one's better. So this one was from Hong Kong, where there's an amalgamation. So the one was from China, okay? The other one is from Hong Kong, where there's an amalgamation now of Chinese culture with, what are we going to call it? I wouldn't say Western culture, but certainly an English component because of the history of Hong Kong. And that immediately, right, makes it much easier for us to understand. So when you're driving behind a really slow driver on the road and they've got a white square with the red L inside of it, what does your brain say to you?
Don't toot. It might.
Give them a chance. Don't overtake fast.
Often when you're driving, you forget that you were all there once.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm saying is that the immediately, just that symbol tells you a whole lot about what's going on in that car, which is not necessarily information driven, but is literacy driven. So you understand the context of what that person's going through, and you understand that will impact on your behavior because you don't want to spook them and you don't want to do something dangerous in front of them, like, zooming around them fast, or if you are in a hurry, you want to get away as soon as possible. All of those things speak to understanding the context of what it is, so understanding the world around you in terms of a literacy practice. Yeah, and also, who's ever been to the bathroom in some fancy new shopping mall and seen like how they differentiate between the men's and the ladies? Some of those signs are completely not intuitive, right? Probably the weirdest one you've ever seen.
Yeah, I've encountered them because I couldn't figure out if I go left or right, even though we normally know that woman goes to the right and men goes to the left. But it's that, so yeah, my bladder got very, very full.
You were waiting. I once saw chickens. Okay, so they had a rooster with a sort of big fluffy thing on his head, and then like an ordinary chicken. And I don't know much about chickens, I must admit. So it took me a while to figure out that the rooster one was the men's bathroom. and the chicken was the ladies. I don't know. I think that it's important to feel that you are literate and that you can work things out, but then to understand. Yeah, okay. Christine, is that you? I saw one where one had a cow and one had a bull. Again, without being graphic, how do you know the difference, to be honest? Yeah. So the concept that living in the world is something that adds to our literacy, but also to be able to unpack. You know, they call it the Mary Poppins phenomenon, where that carpet bag of hers in the movie, where she pulled out all sorts of ridiculous things that wouldn't have fitted into a bag that size. Hermione Granger's, extendable little beaded bag that carried the world and a tent and food and everything in it. So all of those things, I like that. All of those things speak to understanding more than what is given, understanding more than what the outside shows you, contributing to your literacy. And we do it a lot in medical practice, right? If I say to somebody, I have to have an MRI for my neck. So what does that tell the person? The first thing they have to understand is what the acronym stands for, right? In medicine, there are so many acronyms, and in university life too. So I'm going to the APDC committee, and I went to CHSE as the unit, and so all of those things, the acronyms need to be unpacked first, but it's not just understanding the acronym. If I say I have to go for an MRI, that implies, number one, that there's been an examination, that there's been a previous X-ray or a CAT scan, those things first, and then possibly, because of the implications of what they might find, so then you have to have an MRI, which tells you a whole lot more about it than the little thing that I said. Am I saying the same thing over and over again, guys? I just think that it's important to see where we do it, because it's so unconscious in us that we don't often unpack. Okay, so now I've got two specific things, one very well known, one not so well known. Let's go with this. Okay. Very famous, both of these pictures. So you tell me, what do you see? You don't have to write if you don't want to. You can shout out too. The first picture on the left is called Rubens' vase.
Hi, Shirra. This is Myrtle. Yeah, I remember this from a psychology course many years ago.
Yeah.
I think on the left-hand side, it's just a perception activity. On the left-hand side, I see a vase. On the right-hand side, I see an old and young lady. Again, emphasis on the perception. It's my experience of understanding the phenomena I'm looking at. Someone else maybe sees something different. But I guess through engagement with everyone here, I'm going to be able to truly get the meaning of what is intended. So my experience of the phenomena is, it might be analytical, it might be perceptive, I think.
Yeah, I definitely see that. So I'm seeing in the chat a whole lot of people saying a vase, a vase, a vase. And then, Akena, you're saying two faces. Yes. And Lizelle, you saw them both too. And the young and the old lady are also interesting. Is there anyone who can't see one or the other? Who can't see the faces but can only see the vase? And who can't see would it be the old lady but only the young lady? Oops. So that's it. Okay, Jean-Luc, you see the two faces now. And can you see the old lady, not just the young lady? Okay.
I think the picture has been cropped because I know this picture from a previous exercise, so I know that there's an old lady, but I think the way that this picture is being cut, you can't see the old lady.
Okay, so you're not seeing her there. Okay, you're not seeing her. Fair enough, and you are right. I just put it on the slide quickly because I wanted people to be able to see. So what this slide for me was about is about it's about mindset. It's about talking about judgmentality. Because when we teach classes, we talk a lot about the facts that we know them as. Yes, Kennedy, sorry, it's right down at the bottom. There we are, Jean-Luc. Thank you for giving us the entire thing. The old lady is much easier to see when you can see her mouth. Just that her nose is the thing that comes out. So thanks for putting in the chat. So I'm talking about the ways that we teach, that we help people to understand the instructional discourse, but at the same time, how we should be planning to talk about the regulative discourse. And the regulative discourse is much, much, much more accepting of difference. So what I'm trying to say is the concept of literacy, as dynamic and as open as it is, needs to involve the possibility that people can change their opinions. And that's not necessarily changing the facts of what you've given them, but very much not seeing the full picture. So, for example, there's a classic, it's a really good example. I gave you half the picture on the right. And so a lot of people couldn't see the old lady because they didn't have all the facts. But when they did have all the facts, finally, the end of the picture, it was much easier to see. So when we learn something one way and teach something one way, we really need to be open to the ideas that people can see it in a different way and that people can learn it in a different way, and that's not necessarily wrong. And that is also part of the psychology, as you said, Myrtle, of understanding how people see things perceptually, but also understanding how it is that they use them as part of their regulative discourse, as part of the rules of the game in the learning that they're doing. And so maybe we need to be more intentional about writing objectives for literacy rather than for knowledge, so that people can use the information and they can be useful with the information when they're in different environments and circumstances. Right. And now my pièce de résistance. And I'm thanking the LXDA team for some really beautiful scans. And now I'm going to ask you, so in the chat, all shout out loud, what is it that you're looking at? Aside from the beautiful turquoise and gold swirl, CHSE's landmark, courtesy of Christine, thank you. But I'm talking about the three images in bars in front of you. What are those? Lizelle, you're saying it's a ribbon. Does look like a ribbon, doesn't it? Beaded weave strips, necklaces. Oh, you guys, you're giving the backstory. You've seen the other side of the postcard. Okay. Yes. So SBIMB, and what does that stand for once we're unpacking literacies? Okay. SBIMB is the Sydney Brenner Institute of Molecular Biology. And this was from last night's launch of the exhibition. They're doing a retrospective exhibition of Sydney Brenner's life. And he gave money towards the institute that we run at Wits. He was a previous Nobel Prize winner, very intimately involved in cracking the code. He worked with Watson and Crick in developing the idea of the double helix DNA, and passionate about genomics and the idea that we can measure and extract and find proteins in relation to the code that's there. That was his life's work, literally. And it is now being extended by the Sydney Brenner Institute. They are doing an enormous study on the genome of Africa. So anybody of African descent all over the world has contributed to the project, but they've worked specifically in Africa, looking at the gene makeup and genetic markers and ways in which the genes unfold. And a lot of their work is visual, obviously, because it's how the proteins lay out in the gels that they run, and also in all the fancy molecular biology stuff that they do. And this is an artist's interpretation through beadwork of the genetic codes associated with that Africa project. And it's completely fascinating to me, because when somebody wears one of those necklaces, and they've made them into necklaces, when somebody wears one of them, they're actually carrying around a sequence on themselves. It's something that a molecular biologist could look at and make sense of. And that's a specific skill in what I'm trying to get to in saying we see things differently, because for a lot of people, it would just be a colored, lovely necklace. For some other people, it might be outside of their culture. So it's not part of the expected bead message that they would see in their own cultural beads, if you know what I mean. And then suddenly there's this transition from art into science and back again to make it into something useful and wearable. So I thought this would be a nice place to stop as an introduction to literacy and why do we need it? Because here it clearly shows that there is so much out there that is giving us messages, and that we need to, for ourselves, categorize and decide how we use those enormous social capital things that happen out there around us, but also to think about how it is we can use those things in deciding how it is we teach our students and help them to discover the joy of literacy rather than knowledge gained and knowledge ticked. I'm going to stop there. Very happy for anybody else to comment. Right, so I'm going to wish you a good afternoon, everybody. And this time next week, 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, we're going to be talking about evaluating your own work in the classroom and how it is you can use those evaluations in developing literacies in your students. Okay, Myrtle, thanks for the message. Yeah. Cool. All right, everybody. See you again next week. Thanks so much for coming. And the recording will be available. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Kennedy.